Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We know others will be popping in and bringing in, but as soon as you have come and settled in, please use the chat box to write your name, share about where you're joining from. Would be lovely to know you. Welcome to the community of practice of foundational learning and secondary education. This particular session is suitable for both and many audiences because it's about community and we cannot work without community. I think that was so beautiful. Thereby, we wanted to extend the invitation to anyone and everyone who's part of the GSF community. Thank you very much for joining us. We welcome you to the 6 global lessons on how family, school, and community engagement can transform education. We are very, very grateful to Center for Universal Education, Brookings Institute, Richa and Emily. Thank you very much for joining and agreeing to lead sessions both in English and in Spanish for our wide community. As always, we're grateful for everyone's presence. We encourage undivided attention because there's a lot for you over here. So if you can pause other things which are there in your mind, we'll take care of that. The rest, which you can do yourself, please do so. Because we know your openness always creates magic. We will record this session as well so that those who are unable to join today, we can share the recording with them along with the key takeaways at the end of the session. A bit about GSF, which you're already familiar with. I will extend a bit more about in the last month or so, we have expanded further. We were last at 133 organizations, now 142. And with all your hard and amazing and collaborative work, I don't even want to count the children which are being impacted or influenced, and the schools and the teachers and the countries which are 64 and growing. So thank you very much for aligning with the mission, which is for generations to follow. And hopefully we'll take this up together. The community of practice is a kind of a safe space which we try to create. It's largely a space where we want to build connections, create alignment on vocabulary, on different aspects of our work. And peer learning is very, very important, while at the same time, as this research also shows, contextualization of whatever we are learning, how can we contextualize for the context in which you work in so that you can influence and impact the communities and work you do to the best of your capacity. In today's session, we are very, very lucky to have Dr. Emily Markovich Morris and Richa Hoysala, who are leading this community of practice session, as well as have been leading this study. We are really, really looking forward to being introduced to the conversation starter tools, reflecting on the amazing 6 global lessons learned, appreciating different gaps as well, and deliberating upon different strategies on how we can take it forward this journey as you continue to work with the community. Before I hand it over to Emily and Richa, I have one question for you, and they have many, many questions for you. But for now, this one question in the chat box, if you can share an experience or a situation where you felt a stereotype which was held either by you or largely by the people who surrounded you was broken or was challenged when you spoke to the parents or when you had an interaction with the community. So with that, you'll have time to put that on the chat box, and I will hand it over to Richa and Emily. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ajay, and to all of you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides while you are writing in the chat. And just stop share for a second. Try it again. Can you see the slides okay? Great. So thank you so much for joining us. And Rich and I'll be talking to you about our collective research, which we call the 6 global lessons today. And a shout out to Educade, who has joined, because they were foundational and really important part of our 16 country, 6 continent collaborative. So thank you to Miriam and Fode in LA from Educade, as well as I think another one of your colleagues, Alianza Educativa from Colombia, also very instrumental in this work. So thank you to those members of the Global School Forum. I am a fellow and researcher at the Brookings Institution. I work together with Richa Hoysala, who's a senior research assistant, and together we are part of a family school community engagement initiative, doing research, collaborative research globally to advance the work that we are doing. But before I get too far in, many of you have already introduced yourself in the chat. If you haven't already, let me just pause and let you do that. And we were going to ask also if to think of a word that describes family engagement to you. What is a word that encompasses family engagement from your perspective? Letting you just put in, I'm seeing co-responsibility, understanding. Okay, I'm going to keep moving forward, but keep putting the thought of the word that what family engagement means to all of you as we go forward. Okay, I'm going to advance to the next slide. And so we'll be talking today about the 6 global lessons on how family school community engagement can transform education. It's a research that we've been doing for the last 2 years together with 15 organizations in 16 countries on 6 continents. So we'll talk a little bit about the research that we're finding, and then we're excited to have a dialogue and to hear from all of you. Just double checking that you can still see the slides, Richa. Yes. So we'll share a little bit today. You'll learn a little bit about the importance of family school community engagement. I know that all of you in the work that you do, you work with families, you work with communities, you work with schools, you bring them together. So we'll be also sharing some of the research that we found together globally and reflecting with you on how this research might be useful in the practices that you do every day. A little bit about Brookings. We are a global research institution. We are based in Washington, D.C., but we work globally. And we work in many different areas, but we are part of the Education's Center for Universal Education, which is a policy oriented, and we produce open access research and tools. And we're focused on equity of helping all young people develop skills to thrive. And so our team, our family school community engagement initiative, is a team of 7 people, and we really are doing 3 things: fostering collaboration and dialogues globally, co-creating participatory and open access tools for schools and communities, and advancing research, particularly research in communities experiencing some of the greatest inequities. And as we'll talk today, the family school community engagement research that exists is very largely dominated by Europe and the US. And so part of the work that we're doing as a collaborative is bringing all of the lessons, all of the strategies and teams together to also advance the family school community engagement research globally, and particularly ensuring that there's research in Latin America, Africa, and Asia that is elevated at the global level, and that we are working together with communities to produce this research. So we'll talk a little bit about the process, why family school community engagement matters. I'm sure each of you could say in your own words why it matters to the work that you do. From the research, we find that it supports academic outcomes of students. It helps with social and emotional outcomes of students. It also supports young people to retain and complete their education. It helps safeguard children against being pushed out of school. It helps children with disabilities and their journey as well as all children. But it also supports schools. And we found, and the research shows, that when schools are being supported, educators also feel supported, because a large reason that educators stay in their profession is because they feel connection to families, not just the retention and strategies such as finance and paying, but also the connection to the students and their communities and their families. We've also been advancing at the Center for Universal Education. Where does family school community engagement fit in transforming education at the systems level? And how do we get policymakers to understand the perspectives of students, families, and educators? And how do we elevate family engagement from a systems level? So that is why our research contributes to this. We have a family engagement and education network, which is over 60 organizations in 19 countries that really has been meeting for the last 5 years. And we are a community of practice that we facilitate learning together and action, and we learn from each other. We help each other solve some of the questions that we're facing. And so part of the teams that are part of this research are also part of our family engagement and education network. So, and we can say more at the end too, if this is an interesting network, to say a little bit more to all of you at the end as well. So now I'm going to jump into 6 global lessons. I'm going to talk through a couple of the lessons and then hand to my colleague, Richa. So again, our research collaborative covered 6 continents, and we have Educade covering Sierra Leone, and Alianza Educativa being one of the partners in Colombia, as well as partners in schools and communities in all 6 continents. And together, we started 2 years really developing this research together. And so one of the things that we were doing was co-developing a set of open access schools that were designed to support schools and communities to do the research. So I'm sure many of you have experienced research where it's outside higher education institutions or research institutions leading the research. We really wanted to create a tool and a process that could be open access and that schools and communities could use to do their research. So we relied on our collaborative to co-develop this process. And going back to what Ajay said about the importance of contextualization, we started there. So we started by the collaborative and thinking about why was each team that was participating in this doing the research? What did they hope family school community engagements would help answer, help address, and why are stronger partnerships between schools and communities and families important for their work? So we started there. And we also looked at when we say community, what does that mean? When we say the students and the educators and the families, what does that mean in terms of different demographics, different needs? Thinking about that and who was particularly families that had a lot of connection and communication with schools, and who were also some of the families that schools had heard less from or perhaps had less interactions with. So we also did this at the beginning, and then we had a process, and I'll share some of the results from these surveys. We surveyed in a way of capturing beliefs and perspectives of youth, families, and educators, not to generalize about what are families experiencing, what are educators and students experiencing, but to understand where they're coming from. And when I say beliefs, I mean beliefs on school, beliefs on teaching and learning, and beliefs on the importance of education, because we often see family and school community engagement research jumps right into what are some of the barriers, what are some of the opportunities, but doesn't start with beliefs. And we know that families have different experiences in education. They have different, some of them positive, some of them negative, and some of them neutral, and that we need to understand where families are coming from first and foremost, and students and educators. So, for example, in the case of Sierra Leone, Educate really found that one out of two of the families had not been to school or had finished primary education. They needed to understand, what does school mean to a family, a mother, a father, a caregiver, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle that is raising a child? What does education mean to them? To start out, we then shared the data back with the schools and the community. So we helped create an easy visualization that didn't take high literacy, that was very visual based, to share back the data. And then we had community-based discussions. So schools and communities organize their conversations. And during the questions and answers, we'll invite Miriam and others to share a little bit about that process as well, that conversation process. But really having families and educators sit down together to understand beliefs, but also to understand the ways, the barriers and opportunities for engagement and relational trust, which I'll talk a little about in a minute. And the idea was then to identify and enact strategies from these dialogues. So it was a process of building trust, but also identifying and enacting strategies, and intentionally inviting into the conversation families that perhaps are not going to necessarily always be in interaction or highly engaged in schools, making sure that their voices were part of this process. And so we can talk a little bit about how the teams did this very inclusively, and did this not in a way of blasting out a survey, but to really doing one-on-one oral quick surveys with families to make sure that all families' voices were heard in the research. And so through this process, we worked and we reached almost 9,500 families, almost 10,000 students, educators, almost 3,000 educators from across early childhood to secondary. We worked in over 235 schools and communities that led this research, and they held over 165 conversations together. And 15 organizations were driving this together, and we did the research together in over 23 languages and in our 16 countries, 6 continents. So that was our really collaborative. And one of our guiding principles comes from our colleague Fode at Educate, and that the idea that schools do not belong by themselves, they belong to the community, and they are the community. And this was really a driving principle for us. And how do we bring families who are often considered a partner in education, but not central to thinking about the ecosystem? How do we bring them in and put them as a center as well, along with together with partnerships with families? And so this was also the driving principle of the work that we're doing. We will talk about 4 of the global lessons today. And we'll share the links for the research that you can also delve into on your own time. But we'll talk today about beginning with beliefs and how important it is to start out with talking about beliefs and education, positioning families as partners and moving away from a deficit approach to families, collectively breaking barriers to partnerships with families, and building at the speed of trust, building relationships with families, but being attentive to trust, relational trust. So I'm going to go through the first global lesson and talk about what we found with beliefs. We found that it is really, really critical, as I said, to understand families, educators, and students' beliefs and experiences in education. That this was really important to not only understanding how to build partnerships, but it's also important to building coherence when we're thinking about education systems change, education transformation, and how to build a shared vision, starting with the beliefs. And so we had 2 survey questions. The first was, what is the most important purpose of school? And so we had a number of iterations of this, tested out in a couple of different phases, and we landed at kind of 4 key areas from the work. And then families, students, and educators could also put their own purpose if this didn't cover. But we asked, is it to prepare for further education, such as vocational? If we're surveying and working with primary school families, maybe it's secondary. If it's secondary families, maybe it's technical or higher ed or something, further education. So that adjusted to the education level of the population that we were surveying. And then, or was it to develop skills for work, what we called economic, or to be active citizens and community members, which we called civic, or was it to understand oneself and develop social skills or values, which we called social emotional? We also asked families and educators and students to think about when they were most satisfied with their own education, either of their student, their child, their students, if they were a teacher, or if they were a student, their own education. And we had similar categories of academic, economic, civic, but asked it, and social emotional, but asked it in a little bit different way. What we found is that sometimes we have an idea of the role of education in society or the purpose of school, but then when we think about it in our own lived experience, we might have a different response. And so we wanted to see what families, educators, and students were thinking and feeling. Before I share out the results, though, of what we found, I wanted to see what you all think and feel is the most important purpose of school. So let me pause, and you can either, if you have a ability to scan this with a QR code, you have a QR code, or you can enter slido.com and the number on the screen. So I will pause and let you respond. And if this doesn't work for some reason, you can also just put it in the chat what you think. Okay, I'll give just another pause, but feel free to also write in the chat. And maybe, Rich, I can have you put the slido.com and the number in the chat, and I'll keep going, but you can feel free to answer that. So what I'm seeing so far is that it's changing. So we have different perspectives, right? And this is something we'll talk about, but we also have found, of course, that education is all of these things. But we asked this question to find kind of the initial reaction of a teacher, of a student, of a family. And we found that this also was a good stepping point to building dialogue and to building community dialogues. So far, I'm seeing right now that our consensus is a bit on the community and the civic, building community and civic. So let's see what families and students and educators thought. So what we found interestingly, when we looked at purpose of school across the globe right now, at the moment that we were doing the research, 2022 to 2024, families and students really saw the main role as preparing learners for further education. And during the dialogues talked about how they were concerned about some of the interruptions with COVID. They were concerned of their children getting through school. They were concerned about their children completing school, and they wanted them to further education. They also talked about how important education was for their hopes for their child, and particularly in families experiencing poverty. The idea of a child would have a better future, more opportunities in terms of livelihoods and work, and support their families and build their communities. So this idea of education is really critical to the economics of the family. What we found though with educators, you'll see here, is it was really different across the world. And so in Sierra Leone, the educators really saw it the same way that the families did, but this wasn't the case in all countries. We found secondary school families in Bangladesh and in Zanzibar, Tanzania, were leaning more towards preparing kids. These were secondary school kids entering near their exams, and they were thinking about preparing them for livelihoods. We had in Brazil and Colombia and in Zanzibar in the US, civic and community being a critical area for teachers, but we also had social emotional in Bangladesh, Kazakhstan, Kenya, and Uganda. You'll see Kenya was particularly high with 82%. They had also, this was for primary, it should say primary school families in Kenya. They had a recent curricular change on the importance of social emotional learning. So it was at the forefront of what teachers were also thinking about as the curriculum started to emphasize more social emotional learning. So these were important dialogues that we had to understand, and we mapped them out to show schools and to show communities. This is an example from the 14th secondary school in Bangladesh, where you can see that families are emphasizing academic and student viewpoints often mirrored their families, or families mirrored the students. So they often were very similar. But the educators in this case, you can say were more emphasizing of economic and social emotional. And when you asked educators in the schools in Bangladesh, they were concerned about the well-being of children post-COVID and some of the things they were seeing in the classroom. They were also very concerned about their children being able to work and move into livelihoods. And the families and students, though, were very focused on finishing school and perhaps getting to secondary education. So having these conversations together was important, and also so that families could often understand what is social emotional learning. But particularly, for example, in Colombia, some of the conversations where we found that families didn't quite understand what social emotional learning is, and they were concerned that there was a lot of emphasis in the curriculum on social emotional learning for their children, but they didn't quite understand what that meant. And they were very concerned more with the foundational literacy and numeracy, and were a little bit nervous that educators were putting so much emphasis on social emotional learning. So it was an opportunity to understand each other's perspectives. I'm going to jump over this in a minute, but when you are, I wanted to ask, when are you most satisfied? So if you're an educator with your students' education, or if you think about it with your own children, how would you answer this question? And if feel free to also answer this in the chat. The same Slido, so you can also just hopefully activate that. Take another minute to allow people to answer. I'm seeing so far what we would call kind of the social emotional being the higher, although getting good marks on subjects and exams there as well. And I keep advancing, but you feel free to keep responding, and we can share the kind of the results back too with Ajay and the Global Schools Forum team. So what we found is when family, students, and educators were asked their satisfaction, that they were really more focused on social emotional, as we kind of saw in our own group, and to William's point in the chat of emphasizing more of the social emotional. And it was telling that families, educators, and students were really concerned with the well-being of children post-COVID, but also with mental health and rising cell phone usage, and also global conversations on access to internet and AI. And so this also, educators and families and students are really interested in, importantly, looking at the well-being of students. So they knew the role of education in society could be slightly different than their own beliefs on when they were most satisfied with their students or their own learning as educators and students. So again, going back to Bangladesh, you can see how this shifted from the previous, where it was families and students emphasizing academic, to families, educators, and students being aligned all on the importance of and satisfied with social emotional learning. So this was also a point of being able to connect with each other, that we may see the role of education differently, but what we are most satisfied is actually very similar. And what does this mean, and how do we support students? I'm going to wrap up here and then hand to Richa, but we also asked them to think about if they were stepping into an ideal classroom as a parent, as a caregiver, or as a student themselves, or as a teacher, what kinds of teaching and learning would they like to see? And there were a couple of different options, 6 options, whether it was more teacher leading instruction, teacher-centered instruction, student-centered instruction, experiential learning, technology, play, or funds of knowledge, or home culture and language. What we saw globally, that educators were kind of emphasizing the student-centered learning, teaching and learning, but families were still teacher-centered in a lot of context, although also student-centered, and not quite understanding that families often didn't understand what was experiential learning, what did that mean, what was play. And interestingly, educators in South Africa, the early childhood, where there's a strong emphasis, were emphasizing student-centered but not play. And so that was also a conversation, is where does play, and educators and families in South Africa talking about early childhood, why was that not sort of an area that families and educators lean towards, play being centered? What did play-centered learning mean? So it was an opportunity to, again, to have dialogues and different beliefs and viewpoints on teaching and learning. And you can see in the example of in Kenya, families lean towards teacher-centered learning. They felt like the teacher needed to be centering this. The teacher was the expert. They wanted to see kind of teacher-centered, and educators were split between play followed by kind of technology-based. And so having conversations with each other, what is play in a primary school context, was really key to them. So our key takeaways here is that we have to understand beliefs, and that family, students, and are concerned about ensuring all young people are getting the skills they need and to furthering education. Yet everybody was really importantly focused on well-being of young person and helping children flourish and helping children thrive, and particularly concerned about mental health and well-being of students and families and educators. But that these beliefs could often vary, even if there were similarities in other areas. And so talking about these differences was really important to the conversation. So I'm going to pause just for a second and ask, if you were thinking about your own school communities or communities that you work with, what do you think families in your schools would say is the most important purpose? Would it be more of an academic, economic, a civic, or social emotional? What do you think they would say? Because this was part of the research too, is thinking from other perspectives. So just have you write in the chat. Think it was academic? Do you think they would say economic, social emotional, or civic? I'm seeing Henry saying academic from Sabina. Civic and economic, okay. From Augustine, academic. From Roman, economic. From Evans, academic leading and economic from Ajay. Okay. So I'd love to hear more from your perspectives as we move into the dialogue. I'm going to just share with you, when we asked also what did families perceive educators thought about the purpose, we found that educators often understood that what the family's beliefs were. So if families were saying academic, educators often understood what their families were saying, even if educators had a different set of beliefs, and students and families' beliefs often were very aligned. But this wasn't the case when we thought about what do families think that educators think. It was often families were thinking educators were focused on academic learning, but they actually were focused on perhaps economic or civic or social emotional. And this was an interesting part of the conversations, an opportunity for families to ask educators why were they emphasizing different perspectives, and understanding this, what we called either the perception gap or the alignment in perceptions. I'm going to hand now to my colleague, Richa. Sorry, Richa. To keep going with the lessons, but please, in the chat, I'm going to be responding to questions in the chat. Feel free, if a question comes up to you, feel free to respond in the chat. Otherwise, we'll have time to talk and think about it and answer your questions and hear from you. So handing to you, Richa.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. So the second big lesson that we took away from this research was positioning families as partners and recognizing the important work that they do supporting children at home. And the next. So the way we define family school community engagement, and we asked a lot of our families and educators and students that we did the research with, and we came up with this sort of collective definition. It's the many ways that families, educators, and community groups come together to promote student learning and development and support schools to thrive. Now, what family school community engagement looks like varies depending on context, but ultimately it's built on trust, and it's ensuring that teaching and learning is equitable, inclusive, high quality, and relevant. There are many types and forms of family engagement. Those that happen at home, like supporting learning at home and caregiving, as well as those that are school-facing, like communicating with school staff, volunteering time and resources, decision-making and leadership, and building community, working with each other, working with community groups, leaders, and organization. Oftentimes we see that educators notice the school-facing engagement types, but they don't often see the important work that families do with caregiving and supporting learning at home. In the next slide, we'll see that there's a difference between how schools engage and involve families, right? When schools that are aiming to involve families lead with their mouth, they often engage in one-way communication, telling families the different ways that they can contribute to their children's education. And the goal of this is to provide a service, is to provide educational service. However, schools that are striving for family engagement guide with their ears. They listen, they engage in two-way communication with their schools to understand what are their hopes, what are their dreams, what are their beliefs, and the goal is to gain partnership. And this is a wide spectrum of engagement and involvement. You know, not everything will fall under engagement. Sometimes you do have to involve families, but the hope is that how can we move towards engagement and building and gaining these partners. In the study, when we asked families, educators, and students, what is the top type of involvement? What we noticed was that families and students saw supporting learning at home as one of the main ways in which families are involved. However, educators saw communicating with school and teachers as the main form of engagement. So like I said, families and students saw the work that the families were doing at home, whereas educators often weren't able to see that and saw engagement as what they did at school. In the next. And this is a snapshot of Colombia. These are the different types of involvement that we asked. And as you can see, families and students supporting learning at home, whereas educators are focusing a lot on communicating with school staff. We also asked, you know, how many of your families engage in school management committees and school governing boards and some of those decision-making bodies, which oftentimes is the most focused and central part of family engagement in education frameworks and national policies and things like that. But what we saw is that very few percentage of families are actually involved in school management committees and a lot more involved in other types of engagement, which is often not focused even in policy. And the big takeaway here for us is that it's important for us to recognize the important and the diverse ways in which families are supporting learning at home and providing support to them in caregiving and supporting learning at home. We'll move on to the next global lesson, which is collectively breaking barriers. Through our research, we found that families and educators both face structural and situational barriers that prevent them from building strong partnerships with each other. Through the research, we identified what are the different structural and situational barriers that families face. Structural barriers often are posed by structures of school and society, such as lack of transportation to school, insufficient communication from school, or lack of opportunities and not welcoming and safe environment. Situational are often barriers that are encountered at home, such as lack of interest or health and well-being of the family members. And there are overlapping barriers, which are both structural and situational, such as financial constraints, lack of time, technology, and language, literacy, cultural barriers. So families not having flexible work arrangements, so they're not able to take time off to come to school. They may have financial constraints that prevent them from engaging with their children's education. And when we asked families, educators, and students what were some of the main barriers that they faced, this is what the data showed. The top barriers were the overlapping structural and situational barriers, namely financial constraints and lack of times. And when we asked families, like, can you elaborate a little bit more on this? Often what they said was, we engage in work that don't allow us the opportunity to take time off to come and engage with school. We are living in poverty, or we have financial constraints that prevent us from, taking time off and coming to school. And some of the qualitative findings that we found. Oops, sorry. I'll do it. So this is a snapshot from Australia, which is quite interesting, and it shows us the trend that we saw across. When we asked families, they said, it was lack of time, financial constraints, but when we asked educators, they often assumed that families lacked interest, and that was the main barrier for families. But when we spoke to families and we had the conversation of like, this is what educators are thinking, and this is what families are thinking. What families said was, it's not that we don't have interest. We care deeply about our children's education, but we're not able to show up to school, to parent-teacher meetings, to school events because of other constraints. And educators weren't able to see those other constraints and just assumed that the reason that they're not coming to school is because they don't have interest in their children's education. And these are some of the qualitative statements that we heard from students and educators, students and families. A caregiver in England said that she has 3 children in 3 different schools, so it's impossible for her to be present in all 3 places at once. And a student in Bangladesh said, my dad lives in a different city, and so therefore he's not going to be able to be as involved in my education as a parent that lives close by. So there are a lot of these structural and situational barriers that our families face, and it's important for us to come together to identify and recognize them and collectively break those barriers. Which is our big takeaway. And what we saw was that because educators thought that families lacked interest, there was a blame game happening. That educators blamed families for their lack of interest. But at the same time, educators also felt blamed. They felt like all of the responsibility of engagement and their children's education was on them. So the big takeaway from this research was, how do we bring the educators and families together, recognize what are the structural and situational barriers that they're facing, and how can we collectively overcome them and break this blame game. And core to breaking that blame game is relational trust. It's important for us to build trust between educators and families, and often this takes a lot of time to build trust, and we overlook this important step. And understanding the beliefs of families is one of the fundamental steps to developing this relational trust. So through the research, we developed a relational trust scale, a way to identify the different components and measure relational trust. So as you can see on the left side of the screen, these are the different components of trust that we measured and reflected on through this research. So we had competence, respect, integrity, shared vision, care, culture of listening, and interactions. And in a moment, I'll tell you what each of those means. Emily, sorry, you'll have to. So yeah, shared vision. Do you share the same beliefs as educators and families in your school? Is there a culture of listening, taking inputs from each other? Do you show respect? Do you show care? Do you follow through on your promises? Do you show each other that you're doing a good job? Do you show that you think the other person's competent? And are there multiple opportunities for interaction? So when we asked educators and families how much they trust one another, what we found was educators often reported a lower level of relational trust with families than families and students with educators. So as you can see, families and students often had high levels of trust in educators, whereas educators had moderate levels of trust with families. We also saw that trust varied across school age. As students moved from primary to middle to second, we saw that the level of relational trust decreases because schools have less and less opportunities to engage with families. Because as you go to secondary school, you work with multiple teachers. So the level of interaction goes down, and therefore relational trust goes down. Also in secondary school, students become a mediator. So schools start sharing information through students. And so therefore the interaction goes down, and therefore leading to sort of lower levels of trust. And the key takeaways for us is that relational trust is foundational to strong partnerships. It's both the outcome and the means to developing partnerships. And it takes time, but it's important to dedicate the time and resources to build the relational trust between family, school, and students in order to build sort of the shared vision and a common understanding of what education systems transformation and what education in your communities should look like. I'm going to pause here. We've gone through all of the global lessons so far, the 4 global lessons: positioning families as partners, beginning with beliefs, collectively breaking barriers, and building at the speed of trust. I want to see if you all have any questions about the data that we shared, anything that stood out to you, anything that's resonating with the work that you're doing.
We also have Miriam online that can also answer questions about the process as well. And I see Augustine is coming off mute, so we'd love to hear from you, Augustine.
Yes. Hello. Hello.
Hello. Thank you for joining.
Yes. Mine is not a question, but I just want to really appreciate you for this wonderful presentation. Honestly enough, having gone through all of your slides, all of the issues you presented are exactly what are they are the issues really affecting children's learning in Sierra Leone. You know, I am really happy about it. And when you are presenting, I was now thinking, this beautiful presentation, how can we cascade it to the very communities we are working with? It's really not easy. But to me, I want to thank you very, very much. The presentation is superb, perfect, and wonderful. You know, when you are presenting, I was like asking myself, oh, these people who are like in these communities, how do they get to know about all of these issues? So once more, again, I want to say a very big thank you to you. And I also want to say that this is a very good document, and we appeal to you that you can share this presentation with us so that we can also take our time to go over it again and really look at it very well, so that some of the findings and recommendations you have, we can now cascade them into our community engagement and meeting with other stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Augustine. I know Miriam's having internet challenge, but I want to do a shout out to the team. So Rising and Educate in Sierra Leone, again, one of the things that the global community learned from the work was how to engage communities. And so Educate and Rising, when they were starting this work, were thinking, okay, we'll bring families into the school, and quickly found out through the surveying process that that was not the space that was going to facilitate the most open conversations. So they quickly pivoted and held them in the barres, the communities near to where the people are living, to where they thought about what are the communities that should be a part of this, working with the mommy queens and the leaders of the communities to have these dialogues in. And so they said, let's not bring families in, let's go to the families and have these dialogues. And I think this was an inspiration for teams around the world. I know our colleagues and principals in the US were thinking, no, we can't go and do the communities. And then they started questioning why not? And why would we have families that are not necessarily, or sometimes families that don't feel comfortable in schools, or there's a transportation barrier or a technology barrier to joining conversations? Why don't we go to communities? And I think the Sierra Leone team really pushed the global to think differently. And they also were very helpful in helping principals in Australia and the UK and in the US think differently about how do you do surveys, because it was automatically done in Creole, in short verbal surveys. And I think there's a tendency in a lot of countries to blast out surveys to families. And the team in Sierra Leone said, no way. Like, we don't, literacy, we don't want that to be a barrier, but also being able to have these dialogues with families is really important. And in Tanzania, they found, and what I was at one of the data collections with the school teams, and then I'll hand to Roman. The family, we saw a bunch of people from the communities sort of as they're doing community surveying outside. Some people from the community were just hanging around while they were doing one-on-one surveying. Some of our parent leaders and our youth researchers, and having these one-on-one surveying with the schools. And we went over to the community members and said, are you here to participate as families in the surveying? And they said, no, we're not going to participate. We're just here watching. We don't have children. And then after they heard people coming away from doing the surveyings, they came back and said, no, we lied. We are parents. We were just so afraid to come to the space because we've never been called except when our child is in trouble or they've failed. And so this was a realization for the team, Malala Zanzibar Foundation, of how do we reset this and how do we do it in different ways? And so once they found out that they were being asked their beliefs, their thoughts, their experiences, we had so many families coming, and then they had the opposite problem of having so many families wanting to participate in the dialogues that they had to figure out how do we have dialogues and limit the families, because we can't do it necessarily in these big focus groups with 10. So we actually had a great problem of all the families wanting to contribute once the team thought about how do we reset this. So handing to you, Roman, for your question or your comment.
Thank you so much. It's really wonderful presentation, and I really learned a lot. I have only one question regarding the preferred pedagogies that families prefer, that teacher-centered and student-centered, and education prefer the student-centered, and students prefer the technology-based learning. So are they going to choose from the student-centered method? Like, it is one of technology-based learning is one of the student-centered method. So are they learn, like, if it is a student-centered, there is technology-based center, that is one of. So are they going to choose that one, specifically the technology-based center, or like another method? Like, I need to be like clear on this.
That's a great question. And so we're talking about the preferred pedagogy. I'm going to share just this slide so you have it in front of you again. And then, Richa, jump in. So when we asked them to think about if they were choosing a classroom for themselves as a teacher, or if they're choosing a classroom for a student, what would they want to see? And so it was kind of a scenario-based question. And then we had a conversation about it. So with technology, you'll see the educators and the families that chose technology was Bangladesh. So the one kind of country that leaned towards that. And during the dialogue, they were talking about, we were during the COVID pandemic when things went on to virtual learning, we did not have these capabilities, and the schools were largely rural in the sample. And so they were really concerned about technology being more central to learning in secondary school because they were coming out of the experience in the pandemic, and children not having the opportunity to learn during this time and prepare for exams, for their secondary exams. So that was kind of what they said when they chose technology. Experiential learning, interestingly, educators and families, for example, in Tanzania chose that. But then during the dialogue, students were the ones that said, in reality, what is experiential learning? And so they often found that families had quite a different definition. They'd been hearing about it because it was a curriculum change and emphasis on experiential learning, particularly for secondary school students. But what does that mean? And the students actually were quite frank of saying, we have large classes, we have limited resources. Like, what does experiential learning mean? And I would like to think that it's an ideal, but like, it's very hard to actually implement it. So they were very critical in some sense. And so we often found that they were repeating language that was part of a policy or curriculum change, but they didn't quite necessarily understand, for example, what is experiential learning, and why it was important. And so sometimes technology-based learning can be very teacher-centered, sometimes it can be student-centered, but they were often choosing the things that they had been hearing about or learning about and thought would be kind of the best modes of teaching and learning. Home cultures and language, the one families chose there, that was Kazakhstan. And they've been going through a transformation in education from kind of Russian-based language to Kazakh-centered lesson. So it was also part of their kind of cultural identity and the shifts of changing a language at the school level also. So families were very keen to see Kazakh continue and Kazakh culture continue to be centered in learning versus kind of the previous experiences for many of the families of being more Russian-centered instruction. So I don't know if hopefully, Roman, that answered a little bit your question, but feel free to follow up.
Emily, we also have another question in the chat.
Yes.
Verbal one-on-one in-person survey is the best method to collect data. Interested in the most effective survey process to get accurate data on this, ensuring maximum engagement, especially in rural areas.
Yeah, I would love if Miriam, I think we might have Miriam, if Miriam can speak to this one. If not, I can answer. Miriam, are you able to hear and speak to that about the oral one-on-one?
Sorry, could you just say it again?
Sure.
The question was, what is the most effective way to get accurate data? Is it one-on-one verbal survey, especially in rural settings?
So absolutely. The one-on-one, sitting down, facing the parent, but like reassuring them that, you know, they're in a safe space and, you know, being a smiley, like just safe person to talk to, was the most effective, and particular, as you said, going out and meeting people where they were, so they didn't have to come. One of the things that really struck us about this whole process was that in order to reach the most marginalized, who often, you know, there'll be some parents that whatever you call them in for, they come in. And this was deliberately trying to go on and beyond the obvious ones. And so the structure that Brookings had us use was to, you know, if in a particular school, we wouldn't just go and try and get as many parents as possible. We would try and get every last parent in class 3 or every last parent in class 2 or whatever. And that actually pushed us to reach some of the parents who would not normally necessarily actually be involved. But that then sitting down one-on-one with them, being able to reassure them, that really did make a difference and enabled us to get voices that aren't always accessed.
Thanks, Miriam. And I'd say another thing that it allowed to do was to do multiple languages. So in the West Nile, Uganda setting, we used 4 different languages. And these languages, we relied on sort of representatives from the community that could help do them in the different languages. And so that was also really important. In Australia, they chose, I think, 7 languages. And they were going to do it one-on-one and didn't do it one-on-one, and the response rate was radically different. So those that did one-on-one surveys and did the work that Miriam and team, they were able to get 70 to 80 to 90% of the families that were targeted. And I'll just say that we intentionally didn't target all families in the school. We focused on perhaps like grade 1 and 2 if it was a primary school, and trying to get as many of those families of grade 1 and 2 in, so that they could do a very good job of trying to reach all of those families. And to break through the barriers. And so that helps sort of with the inclusion of as well. But those that did the one-on-one had very high interaction and response rates compared to those that, and particularly it was just the US and the UK that didn't do the one-on-one. Those were the only countries that didn't do the one-on-one. So it was quite different, and the language capabilities of, and I think also they thought carefully of who would do these surveys. In some communities, it was parent representatives. Sometimes it was community, they were partnering with a community group, and it was community members. In the case of Educate, it was Educate, which was known to the community. And with students, it was often student youth led. So we did it in classrooms in the secondary school, and youth were trained to do that. And they did it with other young people in the classroom, and had dialogues among the students and the youth without the presence of teachers and principals, et cetera, in those dialogues, to give them space. I'm seeing Ajay's question. Is there a similar study conducted in a similar or different context, which you found really useful? Yeah, that's a great question. Richa helped me a lot. So maybe Richa, thinking about, we on family engagement, we couldn't find a collective cross-continental on the topic of family engagement to this extent. This was the first of its kind. But we did, I'm trying to think, Richa, of other studies that were really helpful. So a lot of community-based work we drew from. So community-driven, community-based perspectives and learning, and participatory action research was an area. So it may not have covered family engagement, but there were a lot of other participatory action research studies that had the same philosophical approach to engaging communities. Richa, if there's any others that you can think about.
No, I think you've said it all. I think the thing that we noticed, like Emily said at the sort of top of the presentation, was that most of this research was conducted in Europe and the US. And even when we looked at refugee population, it was refugees who were resettled in Australia, Canada, and the United States. So it was really important for us to get data and hear stories from families who are not just in the US, Canada, and Australia, but in Europe, but also other parts of the world. And there were very limited studies that sort of shed light on that.
Yeah. And I think there is pieces of work like grandparent engagement, father engagement, but there wasn't anything kind of collective or like a set of tools. And part of it was also taking to what one of our colleagues, Nilufar, one of the principals in Bangladesh, said. It was taking and creating tools that schools could use for themselves and communities, and allowing educators to be the experts of research versus often thinking about it as the outside academic as centering that. And so that was one of the intentions of creating these tools. So we did find other kind of participatory tools of this process that we used kind of to influence it, but nothing particularly in family engagement that existed. Our next steps too, and I'd love your thoughts on some of these next steps, and Rich is going to share strategies. We're wanting to work more on what does communities mean? So what are the different ways community organizations, and so this community meant different things in different context. In a US context, sometimes it means like the partnerships with health institutions. Sometimes it means partnerships with like reading partners or organizations building foundational literacy. In the case of Educade, they identified also the community leaders being kind of more of traditional leaders, as well as some of the women's group leaders and others. And so also understanding what is communities and how do we build these relationships to support schools was really important. And so that's a part of our next work, as well as we found that families of children with disabilities often engage a little bit differently with schools because they often have to. They have no other choice in a lot of contexts to be more engaged because they have to advocate for their children. So what can we learn about families of children with disabilities as a part of this research that we will also continue with, as well as developing out the relational trust? What does that mean? How do we build that trust? So if there's a particular part of this research that speaks to you, please be in touch with us as well as we continue down with building the trust and building research with families of students with disabilities as well. Any
That's
other? Go ahead.
incredible.
Go ahead.
Emily, I think you that's why you also asked us on the poll about the community in the
Yeah.
WhatsApp which we shared. Was there any specific learning from that, from our community shared?
Yeah, I think the big learning for us was that the diversity of what community means, but the power of community, and that community often helps schools feel like they're not alone, and educators feel like they're not alone when these community relationships and the trust is high. And in the US, for example, we're seeing this kind of a deterioration of trust with community because the community are also critiquing schools, critiquing teachers. And so we're finding that the learning from the global, so particularly our colleagues that are working with communities in Africa and in Asia, there's a lot for the global north to learn from how that's done, because we often don't do that very well because it becomes politicized in a US context or an Australian context. I don't know if Richa, you want to say more about that piece?
Yeah. I think the other question that we'd also asked, which was fascinating for me, was how does the community use research? And a lot of it was to inform professional development, which was really fascinating to see. Different communities use it differently. But one of the things that we're hoping to see is what are the different ways in which that this research could be helpful for you. Of course, teacher professional development is probably a key activity and program that most civil society offer, but what else can how else can we sort of work with you all to use this research more broadly in ways that will help you and your communities?
Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Augustine.
Yes, I just want to join you people to maybe add to what you have just said. The question our brother asked regarding this issue of families and communities. You know, there is a saying which says the community and the school coexist. The school cannot work without the community. And when you look at the home, when we talk about education, from every angle, education started from the home. So we are very, very much concerned about the home. And even when we look at the timing, the contact hour in the school is lesser as compared to the contact hour in the home. So, you know, working with communities, having a stronger families, schools, and community relationship can help to transform education. That one is clear. So in whatever we are doing, those people, more especially when we are talking about children, you cannot plan for children. You only target the teachers or the school leaders. But the parents and other community stakeholders, they are very key. They have a crucial role to play in the education of that child, as well as the well-being of that child in every society we are thinking about. That is my submission.
Yes, that's a great point. And so one thing, just a note on what Augustine said, is we are using, each team is developing a kind of a policy brief or a research brief for their context. So we have the global research. And so, for example, we finished the one for Sierra Leone. We shared it with the Ministry of Basic Education, and we developed it with Rising and with Educate, and 5 key recommendations from the findings. One being that families need to understand how they can support learning at home, particularly families that have maybe low literacy levels, and that don't feel like they know how to support learning at home. Because to what Augustine just said, students spend a lot of time out of school as well. And so we elevated strategies in Sierra Leone, such as Educate's mother and father kind of caregiver checklist, where it's pictures of things that they can do to check on their children's learning with their student. So like a pictorial list that they can say more about. Thinking about, okay, radio programming. How do we use the power of radio to communicate how to support learning at home? And so part of this is also really thinking about it in the context and working with teams to center it, to Augustine's point of what are some of the deep recommendations we can give contextually by the community.
If we have no more questions, we can move, and I can share a couple of strategies that we have with you, and also talk a little bit about the tools that we've used through this this research. Emily, I can share my screen since. Okay, never mind. So the Center for Universal Education has developed a lot of open access tools and research to help you and your communities build greater family school community engagement practices. The conversation starter tools approach is the approach that we used for this research. You know, the 4 steps of contextualizing, collecting beliefs, discussing the beliefs, and identifying new strategies. This has a set of tools which includes the surveys that we use, discussion questions, focus group questions, contextualization checklists, so on and so forth. We also developed a school-based rubric to help schools assess and reflect on different elements of family school community engagement. We also have a strategy finder, which is an interactive database of strategies that we've gathered from around the world. And I'll share a little bit more I'll share a couple of strategies from there. And we have 2 big research publications, the playbook, which was sort of the first round of research that we collected, and the 6 global lesson, which is the research that we've been sharing with you now. Towards the end of this session, we'll share with you the QR codes and links, and we'll also send it to Ajay so he can share it widely with all of you. I'm going to elaborate a little bit on the rubrics, which is one of the tools that was developed during this research. Our research collaborative came together and identified this need of a rubric to help them and help schools better understand the current state of family school community engagement, but also reflect on and identify new strategies that will ensure that schools are more inclusive and welcoming for all families. And the rubric is based on a rubric from the Colorado Department of Education. It has 4 key elements: creating an inclusive culture, building trusting relationships, leveraging families as assets, and sustaining meaningful family school community engagement practices. Each of these, as you can see, there are 3 questions under each element, and each of them has their own rubric. And we can share this with you so you can see how your school teams can, identify where your schools are and sort of identifying steps forward to improve family school community engagement in your communities. I'll also share a little bit about the strategy finder. So this is what the strategy finder looks like. It's a collection of over 62 strategies that we've gathered from different organizations from around the world. And you can sort of filter these strategies based on student age, the tech level, but also like, what is your goal? Is it to provide information? Is it to build relationships, shift mindset? So we've sort of categorize these to help you identify the best strategy. And today I'm going to share a little bit about 2 of them. The first one is one that we heard from Canada. This the Sky to Sea School District is a pretty large school district with over 5,000 students, and a significant population comes from the First Nation community. And the district needed to develop a new education plan because and wanted to address the inequities of graduation rates between the First Nations and the non-First Nation students in this district. And the strategy that they used was a community working group on education. They created a roundtable of over 50 people, and they invited school leaders, parents, students, but also elders and community champions from the community to understand what are the core beliefs and purposes of education, and how can they come together to create an education system that was inclusive of all families and contextually responsive and relevant to each of the students. Another strategy that we want to share with you comes from Brazil, and this is the community members mentor. This district, they had a pretty high dropout and failure rates in school. They also had a large influx of Haitian and Venezuelan and refugee population who did not speak the same language as the community. So their language of instruction was different from the language that they spoke at home. And they also found that the school climate was quite rigid and strict. And the entry point was that there was a collective of families and teachers that wanted to invest in transforming the local education and improving outcomes for all students. And one of the strategies that they came up with was to have a personal tutor for students and staff members of the school. And tutors could be parents, could be other community members and family members who would meet with students and staff members weekly to identify like what are your goals, what are the challenges, and to provide individual sort of one-on-one support to each other. And amazingly, one of the tutors for the principal was a mom in the school. So it was a great way to build relationships between the community, the school, and the staff and the parents, but it was also a way to position families and community members as experts and as assets of the community. Here are a couple of QR codes for the tools and research. We'll also be sharing this with you in emails, but I'm going to pause here to see if you have any questions. We'd also love to hear strategies that you're using to build relational trust between families and communities and schools, or any other ideas that you have.
And just to Noreen's question, to Noreen's point in the chat, we are online. You'll find the research and the tools are in Spanish and Portuguese. They're in the process of Arabic and French. Being there, they'll be up there shortly. We have the 23 surveys in multiple languages, everything from Marathi to Bangla to Portuguese and to Hungarian. And so we're also working on putting those surveys up so that teams can also have access to those surveys as well. And the strategies, please, as we're going to be in 2025 building out more strategies. So these are kind of strategies that have been studied and used globally, and we're looking for particularly strategies of how community engagement is supporting schools. So I know that's an important piece, and that we asked you a little bit about that in our questionnaire about what is community to you, and we'd love to hear kind of follow up if you have some strategies that in your own context that you're willing to share with us.
This is really, really incredible, Emily, Richa, really, honestly. I think we'll have a lot of resources to share over the email as well. But we have a ritual which we do, which I'm sure everyone is aware of. That ritual really helps us connect visually also. So if you could switch on your cameras, I'll count from 5 to 1. Let's have a picture together. And then, I'll share the poll as well. And also a place where I would encourage, Sabina from Pakistan, Nazia Brack works across. It'll be really great to hear from their perspective also what happens in different contexts, which have not been catered to in the research. But yeah, cameras are being switched on, which is great. Thank you, Mariam. With the low internet you have, you're encouraging others to switch on the cameras. So let's count from 5 to 4, 3, 2, and 1. Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me switch on the poll as well. So because if you need to drop off, please do give us feedback. That always really helps us design other sessions. So I have sent out the poll as well. It should be up on your screens. But of course, we can continue the conversation while you're filling the poll as well.
Noreen, I was also just your point about the contextualization of the surveys. I didn't want to let that go, but there was a lot of work on that, and the demographics were completely different based on the country. So sometimes it was based on the census. So how, for example, race or ethnicity or language was asked was very different, gender, and in communities of displacement, there was additional questions. And so those were co-designed with the teams. But we had some of the foundational questions the same so that we could compare and have kind of a dialogue across. But that took a long time to get to the language. For example, on the civic and community, that was a long back and forth within teams. And there was a lot of field testing in each of the languages with communities and families and students. So hopefully I did justice to your great question.
You did.
Sorry for
Thank you so
keeping-
much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Would anyone from their context would like to share how do you engage with the community? If you've developed surveys, what have you? What are you taking away, or how you do it differently?
Can I
Yeah,
say
I'm happy to
something?
share. Sorry, go Roman, you go first.
It's okay, you can jump in. Okay, so here I'm based in Ethiopia, so I work for Luminous Luminous is working for out of school children. So we do have some do a kind of accelerated education program working in out of school children. So one of our program pillar is engaging parents in our learning and through our teaching learning process. So we invite parents in our classroom and to give as experts, share their experts, and they will share their life, what they're doing. Maybe they're farmer or something kind of that. We try to integrate the lesson with them and give them some time to spend in the classroom having a conversation with us with each of the group member in the classroom. So this is one of, we call it a family-based learning, and we also say it like expert visits. And we work for using a community-based learning. It is one of our method to use. Like students will go outside the school and visit some community and have a lot of sharing some experiences. So it is just give us a chance to invite parents in our classroom, more engaging to the teaching learning process. It just, even for the students, are making them like proud, and it just give us some kind of great attendance rate, and they will like waiting. Other parents are, well, like the other student will, my parents will come next month, and he will tell he's a farmer, he's going to tell something like that. So we use this kind of strategies to engage parents in our classroom. Thank you. And thank you so much.
Yeah, hi everyone, I can come in, and thank you so much for sharing the incredible presentation. It was so insightful. I just would like to share some of our experiences from BRAC. So as BRAC, we actually implement in different parts of the world, both in Asia and Africa. So but we have a common element which is very core in our program, in all our programming. That is the community engagement. In fact, whichever program we design, that's the core model. So, we do it in a different ways. For example, in the communities where we have with the low income families, no schools at all, we actually in those cases, sometimes it happens that the communities are being engaged in the school constructions. So we actually do get together. That's how we engage the communities in the system, actually in the system building process. We also have a very core element on parents engagement. So it's not only actually the construction level, but at each level of the education deliverable. So it starts from from the very beginning when we start actually any education intervention in any community. So first, actually, we hear from them, from the communities and the parents, that what's their perspective. If we are to design a program in a particular context, actually we do a co-creation. We do through a co-creation process. And then at the next level, actually, when those things are being done, at the next stage level, if we have the program, parents are actually, parents and teachers are again actually in the forefront of this delivery. So, for example, when we design our curriculum or design any teaching, any contents, then we also do it together with the teachers and actually even some of the educators in the communities. And and the parents engagement is very key, because we invite parents regularly. Like, we have monthly parenting sessions, and we try to create a sort of bridge between the parents and the school. So in our ECD program, we have our actually both early childhood development program and education program. So it's like from 3 to 12 years old programs in different contexts. So for the 3 to 5 for the young children, what we do, we invite the parents to even being engaged to create sort of play materials or learning materials for the children. And for that process, we actually encourage them to use the local materials, and that's also being done through a co-creation process. So in that workshops, actually, the parents, the teachers, the other community members do it together. So these are some of the examples and the way we actually engage and try to create a bridge among all these different stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nazia. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Richa, for such a wonderful session. I know many others who have not been able to make it. We will share the survey with them as well over WhatsApp, as well as the video recording and the takeaways as well. But thank you so much for your time, and thank you, everyone, for taking out the time for this session. It's really, really great to have you. And if you know anyone who would benefit from the Spanish session, that's on the 31st of October. I'll send out the email details as well. Over to you, Emily.
So sorry, Ajay, but thank you, Nazia, for also sharing that. And we'd love to hear from your strategies. So if you have, Nazia, if you have other things that you've studied and strategies you want to share with us, we would love to hear more about them. So thank you so much for taking the time to share those with us and for helping us learn as well.
Emily.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah.
Have a beautiful morning, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you are. I know you, Emily and Richa, have started at 8 a.m. So it's now 9:30 for them. So have a beautiful day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, AJ.